For roughly 70 years, a few blocks of Lower Manhattan held the distinction of being the most notorious slum in the world. Not the largest, not the oldest. The most notorious, by any measure, the 19th century had for measuring such things. The column inches devoted to it, the reformers who organized against it, the novelists who crossed the Atlantic to witness it. One building, the old brewery, packed as many as 1,000 people under a single roof. In the summer of 1857, about 1,000 men fought in the open street for 2 days before the state militia could stop them. In 1991, archaeologists recovered roughly 850,000 artifacts from the buried privies and cisterns of that same ground. The physical memory of the vanished slum, cleaned and cataloged and stored in the basement of 6 World Trade Center. On September 11, 2001, they were destroyed. Today, the same ground holds courthouses, a quiet park, and the edge of Chinatown. A person can stand at the spot and find nothing. This is the story of what was there. Chapter 1. The Buried Water. Before the slum, there was a pond. Not a decorative pond, not a swamp or a seasonal wet ground, but a deep, cold, spring-fed body of water sitting in a natural bowl among the lower hills of Manhattan, fed from below by a source that predated the city by uncounted centuries, the Collect Pond. The name is a corruption of the Dutch kolch, meaning small body of water. Was New York's principal source of fresh drinking water for 200 years. It was broad enough to skate on in winter and clean enough for most of its history to drink from directly. The city grew up around it the way cities grow up around water. First the houses, then the trades, then the tanneries. The tanneries arrived first, drawn to the abundant fresh water and the proximity to the slaughterhouses that processed the animals whose hides needed curing. A slaughterhouse was established on the northern bank. The tanneries worked leather in water. They then returned to the same pond, carrying with them every chemical and organic byproduct the process required. By the final decades of the 1700s, the collect had become something the city could no longer ignore and could no longer drink from. A decision was made. Drain it. The city cut a canal from the southern end of the pond to the Hudson River. Not a metaphorical channel, an actual ditch, wide enough to carry the water west and out of sight. That ditch gave Canal Street its name, and the name is the only physical trace of the original solution. Between 1811 and 1813, the pond was drained, and the bowl it had occupied was filled in. The earth hauled from the surrounding hills by cart and dumped into the hollow until the ground appeared, at least from the surface, to be solid. The surrounding heights were cut down. The landscape was leveled. On a map, it looked like progress. The trouble was the spring. The underground source that had fed the Collect Pond for longer than any record extended did not stop because the city had removed the water above it. The spring kept flowing into the fill, saturating the loose earth from below, keeping it perpetually soft and wet and unable to bear significant weight. The buildings raised on the filled ground settled unevenly. Walls cracked, foundations shifted. In the warmer months, standing water pooled wherever the ground was lowest, which was everywhere, and the mosquitoes came with it. What the city had done, without fully understanding it, was bury a living water source under unstable fill and then try to build a neighborhood on top. Land that sinks is cheap. Land that stinks is cheaper still. Land that does both, in a city where the price of a room measures the distance between survival and exposure. That land fills with the people who have no other choice. The merchants who had settled the blocks around the old pond when the water was still clean relocated as the ground softened and the smell rose from the filled earth. The middle class followed them out. What remained was property that no one with options wanted. Property the people without options could afford. Several roads converged at a single crooked intersection near the center of the filled ground, beside a wedge-shaped lot of open land that residents called Paradise Square. Paradise Square was neither square nor, by any standard account, paradise. It was an irregular patch of ground where the streets met at odd angles because they had been laid before the filling was complete and the topography had since shifted beneath them. 5 corners met at that intersection. 5 roads fed it: Anthony, Orange, Cross, Mulberry, and Little Water. The 5 corners gave the district its name. They called it the 5 Points. The water is still there. Somewhere beneath the courthouse foundations and the park paths and the basement cisterns and the 2 centuries of fill and building and demolition that have since accumulated above the old bowl, the spring still moves. It does not know what was built above it. It does not know what it made possible by making the ground cheap and then soft and then uninhabitable for anyone who could leave. Keep that water in mind. The story comes back to it. Chapter 2: The Old Brewery. The 5 Points was mixed from its earliest years in a way that most of 19th century New York was not. A substantial community of free black New Yorkers had established itself on the filled ground when the district first took shape, drawn by low rents and the relative absence of the social enforcement that governed more respectable blocks. Alongside them came the first waves of recently arrived immigrants, Irish, German, and others who had landed in the city with almost nothing and found that the cheapest accommodation in New York was here, in the settling earth above the buried pond. The density was unlike anything the young republic had yet produced in a single neighborhood. Groups the rest of New York kept apart by custom, by geography, and occasionally by law lived here because the 5 Points was where a room cost what a room could cost when there was almost nothing to pay for it. This arrangement, free black residents and immigrant poor sharing streets and tenement floors, struck visitors from the cleaner parts of the city as disorder. It was not disorder. It was the logic of poverty made visible. The courts running behind the main streets, narrow and hemmed in on every side by the backs of tenements, were occupied without regard to the categories the city used to organize itself elsewhere: Orange Street, Cross Street, Anthony Street. The names stayed the same while the population turned over season by season, absorbing whoever had arrived most recently and had the least. And then, on the north side of the intersection, there was the building. Coulthard's Brewery had been built around 1792, when the surrounding blocks had not yet settled into their permanent poverty. It was a large structure by the standards of its time, solid and industrial, built for production. It operated for decades. Then, in 1837, a financial panic swept through the American economy, credit contracted, and the brewery on Orange Street closed. Empty buildings in a neighborhood of desperate people do not stay empty long. By the early 1840s, the Old Brewery, the name attached itself almost immediately, a mark of distinction in the wrong direction, had been converted into a tenement. Its interior was subdivided into rooms and warrens that its owners packed with as many as 1,000 people. Not 1,000 spread across a city block. 1,000 under one roof, in a structure built to ferment grain. Basement passages occupied, upper floors occupied, every space where a partition could be nailed into place occupied. The building became, for a generation, the single most infamous address in the United States. Legend held that a murder occurred within its walls every night for 15 years. 1 death per night. The building itself a kind of machine for violence. Whether the figure was precise or the kind of number that attaches to notorious places, because the truth is almost as bad and less convenient to state, the legend did its work. The Old Brewery's name appeared in sermons, newspaper columns, and reform pamphlets as shorthand for everything the 5 Points represented: the overcrowding, the darkness, the disease, and the indifference of a city that had collected its most desperate people on its most degraded ground and turned away. Then came the wave that fixed the slum's character for good. Beginning in the mid-1840s, successive failures of the potato crop struck Ireland with a thoroughness that had no precedent in living memory. Hundreds of thousands of destitute Irish Catholics crossed the Atlantic on the cheapest passage available, and many of the poorest landed on the cheapest ground in New York. The courts filled past any reasonable limit. The cellars filled. Rooms already subdivided were subdivided again, a family to each section, until the space between partition walls could barely contain a sleeping body. The neighborhood had been overcrowded before. After the famine arrivals, overcrowding was no longer an emergency. It was the permanent condition, the defining fact of the place. By the early 1850s, the 5 Points had found its shape, dense, poor, mixed in ways that unsettled the city beyond its borders, and presided over by the reputation of one building on Orange Street. The old brewery stood. The slum stood around it. That shape would hold for another generation. Chapter 3. Dickens and the Dance. In the spring of 1842, Charles Dickens was the most famous writer alive. Oliver Twist had already run its course in print. The Pickwick Papers had made his name on 2 continents. He arrived in the United States in January of that year to a reception that resembled, by contemporary accounts, a kind of organized frenzy. Crowds at the docks, banquets in Boston, audiences who had read every word he had published and wanted to look at the man who had written them. By the time he reached New York in February, he had seen enough of the Republic's celebrated institutions to form a provisional opinion of its character. He asked to be taken to the 5 Points. The request required an escort. The police provided 2 officers to accompany him into the district after dark. Dickens went in on foot, moving through the narrow streets and into the courts with the close attention of a man collecting material. He had written poverty in London, the rookeries of St. Giles, the courts off Drury Lane, and he was measuring what he found here against what he knew from there. What he found was worse, or at least its equal. He wrote it up in his travel book, American Notes, published later that year. All that was loathsome, drooping, and decayed was here, he wrote. The account circulated across Britain and the United States in reviews and in excerpt, in pamphlets and in sermons, until the 5 Points had become for the English-speaking world the fixed image of what a city's worst ground looked like. Dickens gave the slum its international audience. The slum had already given itself everything else, and yet the same block of streets held something he had not expected to find. The 5 Points bred invention the way most of the city bred convention, because when you compress enough distinct human traditions into a small enough space, they do not simply collide, they transform one another. In a dance hall somewhere in those streets, a young free black man known on stage as Master Juba was doing something no one else in the United States was doing. His given name was William Henry Lane. He had grown up in the 5 Points, in the community of free black New Yorkers who had been part of the district from its beginning, and he had spent his formative years watching, absorbing, and then recombining the 2 dominant popular dance traditions around him, the Irish jig and the African percussive styles the black community had preserved. What Lane produced was its own thing entirely, a precision footwork built on the rhythmic logic of both traditions and reducible to neither. Dance historians credit him as one of the fathers of tap dance. Dickens saw him perform. Dickens, who had arrived to document degradation, called him extraordinary. The district was also making something harder and less celebrated than any dance form. The 5 Points bred the first great street gangs in American history, named, organized, and fiercely territorial. The dead rabbits of the Points themselves, the Bowery boys from the street running north, the plug uglies, the roach guards, the YOs. Not loose assemblies of men prone to violence, but structured organizations. And the structure was the point. Control of a block, control of a corner, control of the ground where money moved and police rarely went. They fought for these things with paving stones, clubs, and axes in confrontations that could fill a street for hours. Every block of the 5 Points was, in some sense, contested. The district that the respectable city found so easy to condemn was, for the men who lived and fought in it, a set of territories governed by force. Keep those gangs in mind. The ground that made them was still making things, and not all of what it made was finished yet. By the mid-1850s, the 5 Points held its contradictions without resolution, a place that had given the English-speaking world its definitive image of the urban abyss, a place that had produced a dancer inventing a new American art form in a hall where no one of consequence was watching, and a place that had organized human violence into something resembling, however crudely, an institution. Famous, feared, nowhere close to done. Chapter 4. The War in the Streets. Picture the 5 Points on the 4th of July, 1857. The morning is already loud, and it was always loud in that district, in that season. But by mid-afternoon, a different kind of noise has taken over Bayard Street. Not the noise of the courts and the tenement windows and the street sellers moving through the intersections. This is stone on bone, iron on wood, the sound of about 1,000 men organized into 2 armies and fighting with whatever the street itself could provide. The Dead Rabbits and the Plug Uglies had stormed a Bowery Boys clubhouse that morning, and by the time the police arrived, the battle had already moved up and down Bayard Street in a current that the city's regular officers could not hold. They tried. They were pushed back. The state militia was called, and the militia came, and it took them 2 days, 2 days of organized military presence in Lower Manhattan, to stop it. The episode entered the newspapers as the Dead Rabbits riot, and the newspapers were not wrong to treat it as something other than an ordinary disturbance. It was, by any measure, a declaration. What the riot was not was random. The gangs of the 5 Points did not organize themselves in a civic vacuum. They were organized in the most practical sense by the city around them, by men who understood that a fighting force based in the poorest and most densely populated district in New York was an asset, if it was properly managed. Tammany Hall managed it. The democratic machine that ran New York in the middle decades of the 19th century had a long and particular relationship with the 5 Points, and the relationship was not charitable. Tammany needed votes, and it needed them in quantities a single honest election would not reliably produce. The gangs delivered. Election enforcers from the district appeared at polling places to discourage unfriendly voters. Men moved from booth to booth casting ballots under different names, one ward to the next, reliable and practiced. The machinery for this, the coordination, the muscle, the willingness to stand at a polling station and make the calculus of opposition very clear, was the same machinery that organized the fighting on Bayard Street. The connection ran upward as well as downward. Gang leaders understood that Tammany's protection was worth something. Tammany understood that the vote counts from the poor wards of Lower Manhattan were worth something. Neither side needed to articulate the arrangement. It articulated itself every election cycle in the margins that returned Tammany's preferred candidates to office, and every subsequent year in the selective attention the city's police gave to the courts and cellars of the 5 Points, thorough enough to maintain the appearance of order, careful enough not to disturb the structure underneath. Here, then, was the central fact about the district that its respectable critics could never quite absorb. They despised the 5 Points. They despised its disease rates and its violence and its mixing of peoples that the city officially organized apart. They wrote about it, preached against it, commissioned reports on it, and guided visiting novelists through its streets under police escort. And then, on Election Day, They waited for the returns. And the returns from the 5 Points wards were among the returns that determined who appointed the commissioners, who allocated the contracts, who decided which streets got paved, and which courts kept filling with families. The slum the respectable city despised also delivered the votes the respectable city ran on. This was not an irony anyone in power had to acknowledge. The arrangement required no acknowledgement. It required only that the 5 Points continue to exist. Poor enough to be desperate, dense enough to be useful, violent enough to be managed. The Dead Rabbits riot had lasted 2 days on Bayard Street. The political arrangement it served had lasted decades, and it was nowhere close to finished. The district was armed, wired, and indispensable. It was also, in every account the rest of the city kept, a place that should not exist at all. Chapter 5. The Dying Ground. The water the city had buried was still working, sealed under decades of fill and tenement foundation. The spring that had fed the collect pond kept moving through the saturated earth, rising into the cellars, sitting beneath the floorboards of the ground floor rooms, never quite gone. In the packed courts where families occupied buildings with no drainage and no separation between the waste of living and the water people drank, the buried spring was not simply an inconvenience, it was a mechanism. Cholera came to the 5 Points in 1832 and returned in 1849, tracing each time the same geography. The densest rooms, the wettest cellars, the places where water stood in containers that shared air with bodies too weakened to resist what the water carried. Typhus moved through the district in the ordinary course of a winter, finding rooms with no light and no air, making no distinction between an Irish family 2 months arrived and a free black family that had lived on the same block for 20 years. Tuberculosis did not leave at all. Child mortality reached levels that emptied whole families. Not the emptying of a single event, but the accumulative subtraction of a disease environment that took children and kept taking them. By the early 1850s, the death rate had become an argument, not merely evidence of suffering, but a count that could be marshaled against the district itself. The first people who tried to answer that count were not politicians, but missionaries. In 1850, the 5 Points mission opened on Cross Street, offering meals, schooling, and instruction to the population of the courts. 2 years later, in 1852, a group of Methodist women did something no one had done before. They purchased the old brewery. They bought the building that had stood for a generation as the single most infamous address in the United States and tore it down. In its place, they built the 5 Points House of Industry, dormitories, workshops, a chapel. It was the first time anyone had answered the slum not with literature or sermons or police escorts, but with demolition. The pattern it set would take another 40 years to play out completely. In the summer of 1863, the federal government began drafting men into the Union Army. The draft was not a neutral instrument. A man of sufficient means could pay $300 to hire a substitute, roughly half a year's wages for a laborer in the 5 Points, a sum entirely beyond the reach of the men who worked its docks and filled its tenements. Working-class wards across New York received their notices and understood the arithmetic immediately. On the morning of Monday, the 13th of July, 1863, the first names were drawn at a conscription office on 3rd Avenue. By noon, the city was burning. What followed over the next 4 days was the worst civil violence in American history. It did not remain a protest against conscription for long. Moving through the streets of Lower Manhattan, it became a race riot. Irish working-class mobs attacking black New Yorkers in the streets, in their homes, in places of employment the immigrant community regarded as competition. The Colored Orphan Asylum on 5th Avenue, which housed more than 200 children, was burned on the afternoon of the 13th. The children were evacuated before the building went. Others elsewhere were not. The violence ran from the 13th to the 16th of July before federal troops, some diverted from Gettysburg, restored sufficient order to stop it. More than 100 people were killed. By the time order returned, the 5 points had been written up, preached at, rioted through. It had been fixed in the imagination of the English-speaking world by a novelist who crossed the Atlantic to see it, mapped and measured in reports that calculated its death rates against every other slum in the Western world. A new generation of reformers, younger and more systematic than the missionaries who had demolished the old brewery, was beginning to form a different argument. Not, how do we improve this place, but whether a place that produced these numbers, these riots, this infamy, ought to be improved at all, or whether the only honest answer to a geography that had done this much damage was to take it apart, street by street, until nothing remained. The buried water did not care about any of this. It moved where it moved. Chapter 6. The Man with the Camera. The man who settled the argument arrived from Denmark. Jacob Riis had come to the United States in 1870 with a carpenter's training and no particular prospects, and had spent the following decade in the kind of poverty that qualified him, by experience, if not by birth, to understand what he was eventually sent to cover. By the 1880s, he was working as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, moving through the tenement districts after dark, watching what the city preferred not to see. What he lacked, until the late 1880s, was a way to show it. Flash powder changed that. The technology was new, volatile, and capable of flooding a lightless interior with a burst of illumination strong enough to register on a photographic plate. Riis took it into the tenements of the 5 points at night, into the cellars, the narrow courts, the rooms where families slept in shifts because there were not enough surfaces for all of them at once. He photographed the inside of buildings the city had never seen from the inside, spaces so dark and so crowded that they had existed, for the comfortable classes, only as a rumor, a statistical abstraction, the subject of a reform pamphlet, or a Dickens passage remembered from 20 years before. The photographs were precise, specific, and irrefutable. His book, How the Other Half Lives, was published in 1890. It showed, not in the rhetorical sense of a polemicist, but in the photographic sense of a document, what was happening inside the tenements of Lower Manhattan. It showed the density, the darkness, the absence of air. It showed rooms where human beings slept and ate and worked and died in conditions that no competent farmer would have kept an animal in. A person could argue with a report. It was harder to argue with a photograph of a room that was actually there. The book turned the 5 points from a rumor into a set of images that could not be denied. Riis directed his campaign at the single worst block in the district, a cluster of tenements along a curved section of Mulberry Street called Mulberry Bend. The Bend was, by the accounting of city inspectors and public health officials who had measured such things, the most densely populated and most disease-ridden block in New York. He photographed it. He lobbied, in print and in person, for a decade, naming the Bend specifically, naming the conditions, naming the body counts those conditions produced, and arguing that the only honest answer was demolition. The city eventually agreed. In 1897, Mulberry Bend was demolished and the ground cleared. The landscape architect Calvert Vaux laid out a small park on the site. The park opened in 1897 and was named Columbus Park. It exists there today. Green space, open air, sunlight reaching ground that had not seen it directly for half a century. The foulest court in the city became a park. The park remained. The law caught up with the buildings that still stood. The Tenement House Act of 1867 required minimum window dimensions, fire escapes, and sanitary facilities in new construction. The Tenement House Act of 1901 went further, requiring running water and light for existing buildings. The exact conditions that had made the slum possible The dark interiors, the sealed courts, the absence of air, were made illegal, not reformed, outlawed. As the worst blocks came down, the crowd that had defined the 5 points began to scatter. Reformers cut tens of thousands of windows into interior walls, tore down the rear tenements packed into the sealed courts, and opened those courts to light. The people who had lived in those spaces moved outward into other neighborhoods, into the expanding city that the late 19th century was building beyond its old core. The 5 points did not so much recover as dissolve. It did not end in a single event the way the old brewery had ended when the Methodist women bought it and swung the first pick. It ended in the accumulation of 100 administrative decisions, a condemnation order here, a new window requirement there, until the district that had horrified Dickens and housed the machinery of Tammany Hall was simply no longer present in the form it had been. Its people moved outward into a city that had learned, from the 5 points, exactly what it never wanted to build again. The neighborhood did not recover. It was unmade. Chapter 7. The School of Crime. The erasure was not finished in a single season. Through the early years of the 20th century, the city came back to the old ground again and again, block by block, with condemnation orders and demolition crews, clearing the western and southern precincts of what had once been the 5 points and replacing them with the stone foundations of public buildings. Courthouses, civic offices, the formal architecture of a government that had decided the ground should look like something entirely different. There was nothing accidental about it. The city was not simply improving the neighborhood, it was unmaking it as a place. Street by street, until the crooked intersections and the sealed courts and the geography itself were gone, covered over by something that bore no resemblance to what had stood there. By the time the work was done, almost nothing of the old slum remained standing. The 5 points, as a physical fact, had ceased to exist. What it left behind, as it went, was crime. The district had been incubating organized violence for 60 years, from the Dead Rabbits, the Plug Uglies, and the Wyos, the first organized street gangs in American history, through the election season armies that Tammany managed and deployed. That tradition did not dissolve with the tenements. Around 1900, a man born Paolo Vaccarelli, who had renamed himself Paul Kelly, organized the last gang to carry the district's name, the 5 Points Gang. Kelly was not a brawler in the mold of the men who had fought on Bayard Street. He was an organizer who understood that violence, properly structured, was a business. What he built was something closer to an institution than a gang, a hierarchy, a set of methods, a recruiting pool drawn from the same immigrant neighborhoods that had always fed the points, and a discipline the Dead Rabbits had never attempted. Not a gang in the old sense, a school. Its graduates left Lower Manhattan and did not come back. Johnny Torrio came through the 5 Points gang, absorbed its methods, and carried them to Chicago, where he constructed the city's organized criminal operations with the same systematic attention Kelly had applied downtown. When Torrio needed men he trusted, he sent for them. One was a young member named Al Capone. Capone arrived and inherited Torrio's structure, and what he built on top of it became part of the public record of the 1920s. A second alumnus, Charles Luciano, known eventually as Lucky, did not go to Chicago. He looked at what Torrio and Capone had assembled in the Midwest and understood that the model needed to be national. Luciano organized the American Crime Syndicate, a structure that coordinated criminal enterprises across state lines the way a corporation coordinates subsidiaries. The ground that produced the first American street gangs also produced the men who turned crime into a corporation. The same district, the same logic of organization applied to violence, carried from Bayard Street to Chicago to the national stage. The name outlived all of it. In 1928, a writer named Herbert Asbury published a book he called The Gangs of New York, pulling the history of the Five Points underworld from newspapers, court records, and the oral memory of people who had been there or knew someone who had. What he produced was part history, part urban mythology, a portrait of the dead rabbits and the Wyos, and everything they had fought over, told with the enthusiasm of a man who understood the story, was genuinely extraordinary. The book sold. Then it was filed and largely forgotten. The 5 Points had been gone for a generation by the time Asbury wrote it. In 2002, 74 years after Asbury published it, Martin Scorsese turned the book into a film. The name 5 Points, attached to ground that had been erased for a century, ground that held courthouses now, ground where a person could stand and find nothing of what had once been there, was famous all over again. Famous not for what it was, but for what it had been. The legend had outlasted the place, the tenements, the gangs, and the spring beneath them. The name alone remained, circulating in the culture, enormous and untethered, long after the last brick that had earned it was gone. Chapter 8. What the Ground Kept. On the cleared blocks, the city built the opposite of everything the slum had been. The western and southern precincts of the old 5 Points became the civic center, the courthouses of Foley Square, the federal and state buildings that constitute the formal seat of New York justice. Their facades are stone. Their columns are dressed granite. They were built on the exact ground where lawlessness had been the only government, where Tammany's gangs decided elections, where the dead rabbits held Bayard Street for 2 days against the militia, where a man with a ballot in his pocket walked past men paid to explain what casting it wrong would mean. The law now stands in stone on that ground. The ground does not appear to find this remarkable. It simply holds the weight. To the east, the old slum vanished into a living neighborhood. The eastern blocks of the 5 Points were absorbed, street by street, into a growing Chinatown, dense and poor and immigrant once again, but a functioning community rather than a byword for hell. The ground kept doing what it had always done, receiving the newest and the poorest arrivals to the city, giving them space when space was all that could be given. The specific misery of the 5 Points passed. The logic of the 5 Points did not. It simply moved east. On part of the old ground, the city made a park. Collect Pond Park sits on a portion of the filled earth above the old bowl, and at its center is a still reflecting pool. Shallow and ornamental, laid with stone, maintained and occasionally visited by children who have no particular reason to know what the name refers to. The water that was here before the tanneries, before the filling, before the tenements and the gangs and the photographers and the missionaries, before all of it, is here again. Quiet, ornamental, clean. In 1991, the city began digging the foundation for a new federal courthouse on the old ground, and the archaeologists arrived before the concrete. What they found, in the buried privies and cisterns that had served the 5 Points tenements, was the physical memory of the vanished slum. They recovered approximately 850,000 artifacts, glass and ceramic and metal, personal objects and discarded objects, the material residue of all the lives the ground had held. Not documents, not photographs, objects, the things that had actually been there, handled and broken and thrown away and sealed under a century and a half of fill. They were cataloged, cleaned, and studied, and what they revealed about domestic life and the material conditions of 19th century urban poverty was entered into the scholarly record. Then they were packed and stored in the basement of 6 World Trade Center, which stood 6 blocks north of the old 5 Points ground. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the towers came down, and the fires burned through what the towers held and what surrounded them. The basement of 6 World Trade Center was among the losses. The 850,000 artifacts from the buried privies and cisterns of the 5 Points were destroyed. The most notorious slum in American history was erased twice. The first erasure was deliberate: condemnation orders, demolition crews, the systematic unmaking of a geography the city had decided should not exist. The second was not deliberate. It was simply what happened when objects stored in a basement were in the basement when the towers came down. There is no doctrine that covers this. There is no one to hold accountable. What remains is the ground. The ground holds a courthouse where the lawless district stood. It holds a park where Mulberry Bend stood, open to the air. It holds the eastern edge of a neighborhood doing what this neighborhood has always done. And it holds a still reflecting pool, fed not by any spring but by the city's water system, which runs clean. The pool sits in the park. On certain days in autumn, when the light comes flat across the downtown buildings and the surface has no wind on it, you can see the courthouse towers reflected there, inverted and precise, standing in the water the way the city stood in the pond before anyone decided to drain it. The ground beneath it is still soft. The reflection is clear. Is